Sixth grade. In case we have not met yet in school, my name is Mr. Boyam. I'm one of the sixth grade teachers, and I'm one of the sixth grade teachers that focuses on Minnesota history. So my purpose today with this video is to just kind of walk you through and preview some of the things that you are going to be learning about, and we are going to be discussing together, whether you are in school or at home, um, some things from this Minnesota history unit. So this Minnesota history unit basically covers things within the last 100 years in the history in the state of Minnesota, as well as beyond. So we're going to start, it's 2020 right now, we're going to start in the 1920s. And the 1920s was a period of time known as the Jazz Age. So it was kind of a happy-go-lucky, things were overall really good in Minnesota. Um, Maybe not so much for farmers and agricultural workers, but businesses and cities and things like that were really, really thriving. A lot of times when you think of the Jazz Age, you may think of jazz music, which would be perhaps a little bit further south in the United States. But there was a Jazz Age here in Minnesota as well, kind of right towards the end of the Jazz Age. Um, and actually at the beginning too, but kind of in conjunction with that and then spreading beyond. There was a period in Minnesota called Prohibition. So you're going to learn what Prohibition was, and we are going to kind of talk about that and its impact on Minnesota. St. Paul also had a period of time known as the gangster era, and you're going to get introduced to some characters like Alvin Creepy Karpis and John Dillinger, um, and you're just going to kind of get to know what was going on in St. Paul in conjunction with Prohibition, and again, kind of right towards the end of the Jazz Age. Unfortunately, at the end of the Jazz Age, we run into the Great Depression in the 1930s. So you're going to learn about the Great Depression in Minnesota and the 1930s, and its impact on our world. Some things that people tried to do to try to help that, like the New Deal. We'll explore that. And some other things that were kind of put in place to try to help a really tough time in the state of Minnesota and beyond. But what really helps the state of Minnesota ends up being a war, which sounds crazy and terrible, and in a lot of ways it is awful. But we're going to talk about how World War II tends to kind of pick up the economy. There's a growing demand for jobs and higher amounts of need that are out there. So we experience this economic turnaround, which happens so fast that we actually find ourselves in short supply of stuff, like food, because all of a sudden we're sending food off to military members that are overseas. So we're going to explore that a little bit. And if you know anything about COVID, you know that there's some things that we are in short supply of today as well. There's some things out there that are hard to find. And so kind of to remedy that or to try to solve that problem, both during World War II and a little bit today, you might see signs on shelves for certain things that say you can only buy one of these or you can only buy two of these things. And so that's known as rationing. So we're going to talk about rationing. It was a little bit more extensive during World War II and during that time with ration stamps and ration books. But we're going to learn about that and maybe draw some connections to what we're seeing in our world today as well. Then from there, we're going to go into what's known as the Cold War. And technically speaking, the Cold War, if you do a Google search, it says that it runs from 1947 to 1991. And so we're really going to look at the early stages of the Cold War. The unique thing about the Cold War was it was a war that was not actually a war in terms of physical fighting and stuff like that. So the Cold War was something that occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union, which you could consider somewhat to be present-day Russia in that area. Um, and so there's a lot of different events that go on, and really it was a lot about styles of government and what was the best way to run a country and what is basically the most productive. So we had different events that kind of found themselves getting tied in with that, like if you've ever seen the movie Miracle on Ice, a hockey movie that kind of has some connections to that. The space race and landing on the moon and getting to outer space. There's a recent book and movie called Hidden Figures that kind of connects with that as well. And so we're going to be talking about the Cold War, and also we had these like bunkers and shelters that people would try to just kind of have, and they kind of had them there just in case. The Cold War, which was really a bunch of threats that went back and forth, in case that turned into an actual war, there was a lot of things that people were doing that were just trying to help themselves just in case something happened. And thankfully, nothing did happen in terms of long and extensive combat between the two countries. When we get to the 1960s and the 1970s, we are going to talk about some protest movements. Now, it's 2020, and you probably know a little bit about protest movements. We're going to rewind to the 1960s, and we are going to study a civil rights protest movement that occurred at the University of Minnesota that really changed the programs that the University of Minnesota offered, both back then and even through present day. We're also going to explore the American Indian protest movement that occurred with a gentleman by the name of Dennis Banks. And then, if you are watching this and you are a girl and you're interested in sports, you will be very interested in the protest movement that we're going to talk about for women's rights, which resulted in something called Title IX. And we'll talk about why that's important to you and kind of some good things that came out of that. So I know that there's protest movements like the Black Lives Matter protest movements. Right now we're in a situation where we're trying to see what's going to happen with sports in the fall and sports in the winter and sports in the spring, and there's some protest movements connected to that. So these are things that have happened really throughout our history, and so we're going to explore some of those in the 1960s and 1970s and try to make some connections to what you're seeing today as well. And then kind of the last thing that we're going to talk about is immigration to Minnesota. And like my family would have immigrated to Minnesota a while ago, but not maybe as long as some of your families did. But if you're watching this video and your background is not Native American and it's not American Indian, you probably are here through some sort of immigration and some sort of movement that took place from somewhere else. So let me give you just a brief history on that. So my dad's side of the family, my dad's mom's dad, my dad's mom's dad's. So my great-grandmother, they moved here from Norway. And when they came here from Norway, they came and they really couldn't afford to buy any farms or purchase any land. So what they did instead is there were land and there were areas where they would try to rent farms, and they would rent things from time to time, and they basically tried to make enough money to one day be able to purchase and buy a farm, which thankfully they did. But the early times were more difficult. And the other thing that kind of happened was my great grandfather, when he moved here to the United States from Norway also. Um, he was looking for work, and so he worked really a lot of his life as a janitor at the state capitol in St. Paul. So he worked for a few different governors as a member of the janitorial staff that cleaned up different areas of the capital for all of the people that were there and doing different policy. So it's kind of my family's, I guess, immigration story, or at least part of it. And I guess the other thing I would say about immigration has always brought about some sort of tension. Let me go back to my family history again. I grew up on a dairy farm 6 miles south of a little town called Battle Lake. And I heard stories from when I was young. In the town of Battle Lake, there was a Lutheran church. And then outside of Battle Lake, 6 miles south, really right next to where I grew up, there was another Lutheran church. And with those two Lutheran churches, they were both ELCA Lutheran churches. But they had two different pastors, they had two different people or groups of people that went to the churches. And I won't say there was a tension between the two, but there was definitely the recognition that the church in town was the Norwegian Lutheran church, and the church that was south of town was the Swedish Lutheran church. And when they were established, there was a lot of talk about the two mixing because of the backgrounds and because of the founders of who developed the church. So when I was growing up and when I was a little kid, I was going into Battle Lake and I was going to the Norwegian Lutheran church. And then when I got a little bit older, obviously a lot of the kids that lived right around where I was growing up, they were going to the other Lutheran church. And so then we ended up making a move, and then we made the really questionable decision to go to the Swedish Lutheran church instead of the Norwegian Lutheran church. So the reason I tell you that story is it all really ties back to things that happen and things that are developed through immigration, and some of the tension that you may find my story to be a little bit silly, and there may be some silly tension, and there may be some more serious tension that develops from immigration to the United States. So we're going to talk about some of the more recent immigrants to the United States, really kind of right after the Vietnam War in the late 1970s. We're going to start talking about Hmong Americans that have come to Minnesota and the United States, and then really work all the way up to the present day, talking about Mexican Americans and some of the reasons why that migration happened, and then moving into Somali Americans as well. So immigration is going to be kind of important in kind of what we end our unit talking about. So that's kind of a brief preview of everything that I put together. I hope that you found some information in this unit. I hope that it kind of triggers your mind as far as some of the things that we are going to talk about as we move through and work through some of these topics that I personally find to be pretty interesting, and I hope that you do too. So, sorry for wearing the West Virginia shirt during the Minnesota presentation, but I look forward to learning and exploring this Minnesota history unit with you that has a lot of historical importance and has a lot of connections to what we have going on in our present world today. So thanks, and I look forward to learning with you.